In the year 1800, the fastest technology on land was still a horse. No engines. No highways. No traffic lights. Yet before that century ended, a noisy, smoke-filled machine would appear, so frightening that some governments tried to ban it. This is the forgotten story of how the automobile was born. If you enjoy deep history explained clearly and responsibly, subscribe now. This documentary reveals how a single invention quietly began reshaping the modern world. At the start of the 19th century, transportation had barely changed in thousands of years. For most of human history, movement across land depended on the same basic forces: human strength and animal power. People walked when distances were short. When they needed to travel farther or transport goods, they relied on horses, oxen, mules, and wagons. This system was familiar, deeply rooted, and accepted as the natural order of life. Journeys were slow and physically demanding. A trip of a few dozen miles could take an entire day or more, depending on weather and road conditions. Traveling between major cities often required days or weeks. Crossing a country could take months. Distance defined opportunity. Those who lived far from markets, ports, or cities were often isolated economically and socially. Roads themselves were a major limitation. Most were narrow dirt paths shaped by foot traffic and wagon wheels. In dry seasons, they were dusty and uneven. In wet seasons, they turned into thick mud, trapping wagons and exhausting animals. Bridges were rare and unreliable. Night travel was dangerous, and accidents were common. Horses powered nations. They pulled plows, carried soldiers, delivered mail, transported goods, and moved people. Entire economies depended on breeding, feeding, shoeing, and caring for them. Cities were designed around animal movement, with stables, feed stores, and waste management forming part of daily urban life. The smell, noise, and limitations of animal transport were simply accepted. Because this system had existed for so long, few people imagined anything radically different. The idea that cities might one day be designed for machines rather than animals was almost unthinkable. No one predicted traffic congestion, fuel stations, paved highways, or personal vehicles available to ordinary citizens. Speed was limited by biology, not engineering. Yet beneath this apparent stability, pressure for change was quietly building. Populations were growing. Trade was expanding. Industrial production was beginning to reshape economies. As societies demanded faster movement of people, goods, and information, the limitations of traditional transport became increasingly obvious. The world was ready for a breakthrough, even if it did not yet realize it. Long before gasoline engines existed, inventors turned to steam as a possible solution to the problem of movement. Steam power had already proven its value in pumping water from mines and driving industrial machinery. The question was bold and revolutionary. Could a machine move itself across land without animals? In 1769, decades before the 19th century began, French engineer Nicolas-Joseph Cugnot attempted to answer that question. He designed a steam-powered vehicle intended to transport heavy artillery for the military. The machine was large, awkward, and slow, moving at a walking pace at best. It required frequent stops to rebuild steam pressure, and steering was extremely difficult. Cugnot's invention is often remembered for a famous incident in which it reportedly crashed into a wall, an early reminder that controlling mechanical power posed new challenges. Yet despite its flaws, the vehicle represented a radical idea, a self-propelled machine capable of carrying its own power source. Throughout the early 1800s, engineers across Europe continued experimenting with self-propelled road vehicles. Britain, France, and other industrializing nations became centers of innovation. These early machines relied almost entirely on steam. They were heavy, loud, and mechanically complex. Boilers needed constant attention, and breakdowns were common. To the public, these vehicles appeared strange and intimidating. They hissed, clanked, and released clouds of steam and smoke. Horses were frightened by them. Pedestrians viewed them with suspicion or fear. Many people considered them impractical curiosities rather than serious solutions. Yet their importance lay not in their performance, but in what they proved. For the first time in history, movement no longer required muscle, human or animal. Motion could be generated by machines alone. This concept challenged thousands of years of assumptions about transportation and power. Engineers refined design slowly, learning through failure. They experimented with different boiler shapes, wheel arrangements, and steering mechanisms. Some vehicles successfully carried passengers. Others transported goods over short distances. Each attempt added to a growing body of knowledge. Despite technical progress, social and political resistance slowed development. Road owners, horse-based transport businesses, and local governments viewed mechanical vehicles as threats. In some regions, restrictive laws were passed, limiting speed or banning steam vehicles altogether. Innovation struggled not only against engineering limits, but against human fear of change. Even so, the dream persisted. Inventors continued to imagine a future where machines could move freely across land, independent of animals. By the middle of the 19th century, it was clear that steam alone might not be the final answer, but the idea of mechanical transportation had taken root. These early experiments laid the intellectual and technological foundation for what would come next. They proved that the problem was solvable. The question was no longer whether machines could replace animal power, but how. In the 1820s and 1830s, Britain had become the center of road-based steam experimentation. The Industrial Revolution was already transforming factories, mines, and canals, and many engineers believed that steam power should not remain confined to rails or stationary machines. If steam engines could move heavy loads on iron tracks, why not on ordinary roads? One of the most influential figures of this period was Richard Trevithick. Known for his high-pressure steam engines, Trevithick believed that lighter, more powerful engines could make road locomotion practical. His road locomotives were capable of carrying passengers and freight, pulling wagons, and traveling independently across public roads. Demonstrations attracted attention, curiosity, and alarm. Steam carriages soon appeared in several parts of Britain. These vehicles were often large and imposing, with exposed boilers, rotating wheels, and visible mechanical parts. They hissed, clanked, and released steam into the air. To engineers, they represented progress. To many ordinary citizens, they appeared dangerous and unnatural. Technically, steam road vehicles showed real promise. Some could travel faster than horse-drawn coaches. They did not tire, did not require feeding, and could operate for long periods with proper fuel and water. Passenger services were even proposed and tested on certain routes, suggesting a future where steam coaches might replace horse-drawn stagecoaches. However, technological success quickly collided with social resistance. Horse owners feared for their livelihoods. Coach operators saw competition. Road maintenance groups worried that heavy machines would damage already fragile roads. Farmers complained that steam vehicles frightened livestock. Accidents, though relatively rare, received enormous attention and fueled public anxiety. Local governments responded with regulation rather than encouragement. Speed limits were imposed that made steam vehicles impractical. High tolls were charged specifically to steam carriages, making operation expensive. In some areas, steam vehicles were banned entirely from public roads. One of the most famous examples of resistance was the requirement that a person walk in front of certain steam vehicles carrying a red flag to warn others of their approach. This law, intended to protect the public, effectively reduced the speed of mechanical vehicles to that of a walking human. Innovation was legally restrained. These restrictions did not reflect technical failure. Instead, they reflected society's discomfort with rapid change. Roads had long been social spaces shared by people, animals, and carts. Introducing powerful machines disrupted familiar rhythms of life. The sound, smell, and speed of steam vehicles challenged deeply held expectations. As a result, many inventors abandoned road-based steam in favor of railways, where tracks limited interaction with the public and allowed higher speeds. Rail transport flourished, while steam road vehicles faded from prominence. Yet the lessons learned during this period were critical. Engineers gained experience with steering, braking, suspension, and power transmission, all problems future automobiles would face. Steam on roads did not fail because it was impossible. It failed because the world was not yet ready to reorganize itself around machines. This pause, however, created space for a different approach to emerge. While steam engines dominated early mechanical transportation, some inventors searched for a more compact, efficient solution. Steam engines were heavy, slow to start, and dependent on large boilers. For personal transportation to become practical, power needed to be smaller, lighter, and easier to control. This search led to the development of internal combustion engines, machines that generated power by burning fuel directly inside a cylinder. Unlike steam engines, which relied on external boilers, internal combustion engines converted chemical energy into motion more directly. Early experiments with internal combustion began in the first half of the 19th century. Various fuels were tested, including coal gas, hydrogen, and liquid hydrocarbons. Progress was slow, and early engines were unreliable and inefficient. Still, the concept held enormous promise. By the 1870s and 1880s, the internal combustion engine had matured enough to power something revolutionary: a lightweight, self-propelled road vehicle that did not rely on steam or animal strength. In Germany, engineers such as Karl Benz and Gottlieb Daimler refined compact gasoline engines capable of steady, controlled power output. These engines were small enough to mount onto carriages. Unlike steam vehicles, they did not require bulky boilers or long preparation times. They could start relatively quickly. They were lighter, more manageable, more adaptable. In 1885, Karl Benz completed what many historians recognize as the first practical gasoline-powered automobile, the Benz patent motorwagon. It had 3 wheels, a small engine, and modest speed. It was fragile and experimental, but it worked. Yet invention alone does not change history. Adoption does. At first, few people believed in the automobile. It was expensive, unreliable, and required mechanical knowledge to operate. Roads were still rough and poorly maintained. Fuel stations did not exist. Gasoline had to be purchased from pharmacies in small quantities. But something profound had changed. For the first time, mechanical transportation was no longer massive, industrial, or tied to rail lines. It was personal. The automobile promised independence. You would not need tracks. You would not need animals. You would not need to follow someone else's schedule. The road belonged to whoever controlled the machine. Despite technical progress, public reaction was mixed, often hostile. Early automobiles were loud, smoky, and unfamiliar. They frightened horses, startled pedestrians, and disrupted quiet streets. Many people viewed them as toys for the wealthy or as dangerous novelties. Governments responded cautiously. In Britain, strict regulations limited speed and required warning measures. In some regions, automobiles were treated as potential public hazards rather than innovations. Accidents, even minor ones, were sensationalized in newspapers. The unfamiliar always appears more dangerous than the familiar. Yet beneath the skepticism, curiosity grew. Public demonstrations drew crowds. Newspapers reported on mechanical races and endurance tests. Inventors competed to build faster, lighter, more reliable machines. Automobile clubs formed. Enthusiasts shared knowledge. Improvements accelerated. The technology was moving forward, even if society had not yet caught up. By the late 19th century, the United States began embracing the automobile experiment more aggressively. American cities were expanding rapidly. Industrial production was increasing. Wealth concentration created a class of early adopters willing to invest in new technology. Inventors across the country began designing and building their own motorized vehicles. Some relied on gasoline engines. Others experimented with electric power or steam revival attempts. In fact, at the end of the 19th century, it was not yet clear which propulsion system would dominate. Electric vehicles were quiet and clean. Steam was powerful. Gasoline engines were improving rapidly. What separated America was scale. The country's vast geography demanded mobility. Long distances between towns and cities created natural demand for independent transportation. Railroads connected major centers, but rural areas remained isolated. The automobile offered something railroads could not: door-to-door movement. Freedom of direction. Freedom of timing. Freedom of destination. That psychological shift, the idea of personal mobility, would become central to American identity. One major obstacle remained: infrastructure. Most roads were still designed for animal-drawn wagons. They were uneven, muddy, dusty, and poorly maintained. Bridges were fragile. Signage was minimal. Night travel was risky. Automobiles struggled on such terrain. Early drivers often had to repair their vehicles mid-journey. Tires punctured easily. Engines overheated. Mechanical failures were common. Yet instead of stopping progress, these problems sparked new industries. Demand for better roads grew louder. Engineers proposed paved surfaces. Urban planners began rethinking street design. Entrepreneurs saw opportunity in roadside services. The automobile did not simply adapt to existing infrastructure, it forced infrastructure to adapt to it. This dynamic would reshape entire nations in the century to come. By the final years of the 19th century, the automobile had become more than a machine. It represented modernity. It symbolized technological progress and industrial ambition. It reflected confidence in engineering and human ingenuity. Owning an automobile signaled wealth, curiosity, and forward thinking. Yet it was still rare. Production numbers remained low. Costs were high. The average citizen could not yet afford one. It would take innovations in mass manufacturing in the early 20th century to make automobiles widely accessible. But the foundation had been laid. The experiments of steam pioneers. The internal combustion breakthrough. The regulatory battles. The infrastructure challenges. All of it prepared the world for transformation. The 19th century did not produce highways filled with cars. It produced something far more important, the possibility of a motorized future. As the 19th century closed, the world stood at a technological threshold. The automobile was still fragile, still experimental, still uncertain. But it had survived skepticism. It had survived regulation. It had survived mechanical failure. And most importantly, it had proven that land transportation no longer depended on animals. The implications were enormous. Cities would change. Industries would rise and fall. Oil would become central to geopolitics. Suburbs would emerge. Highways would carve through landscapes. Time and distance would shrink. None of this was fully visible yet. But the seed had been planted. When the year 1800 began, the fastest land technology was still a horse. By 1900, the horse had met its mechanical rival. The automobile did not instantly dominate. It did not immediately replace animal power. It did not begin as affordable or practical for everyone. But it introduced a new idea, movement controlled by engineering rather than biology. That idea changed everything. The 19th century was not the century of highways and traffic jams. It was the century of imagination. It was when inventors dared to believe that machines could move freely across land. And once that belief took hold, the modern world followed. The automobile was not simply built. It was imagined, then tested, then resisted, then refined. And by the time the century ended, history had quietly shifted direction. The road ahead would never look the same. If this untold history gave you perspective, share it with someone who believes in history. Subscribe for more history explained clearly. One century, one story, one lesson at a time. Because history doesn't just explain the past. It explains the world we're living in right now. Thanks for watching.